Will you pray with me? Holy One, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The sage tells a story of an angel talking with God, sort of an interview, and the angel says, Lord, have you enjoyed all that you have done in creation? And God says, I have not. And the angel says, why not? Tell me about it. And God says, once upon a time the Israelites needed saving, and so I sent a detail of my angels to save them. And after a time, I heard timbrels and singing on the far side of the sea and knew that the Israelites had made their way across. And then I heard a great noise of jubilation, of shouting and of dancing among the angels. And I went to them and I looked down and I saw what they had done. And I said, why do you sing and dance? And they said, because we have won. The Israelites have passed dry-shod through the sea, and the Egyptians are no more. And I said to the angels, you are dismissed. For how can you sing and dance when some of my people have died? The writer of this story was doing what Christians and our other forebears in the faith have done since the beginning, which is try to figure out what we ought to think about war. How do we understand it? How do we relate to it? What do we do about it? How do we avoid it? How do we prosecute it? And when? Generally speaking, there have been three great movements, three great schools of thought around this. People like Augustine and Aquinas and forebears of theirs, they had what they called just war theory. Maybe you've heard about this before. These are people trying to understand under what circumstances it's okay to go to war, and when you go to war, what it's okay to do in the war. So they had great lists of criteria about how you can judge whether a particular war you're considering entering is just, whether it's okay for you to do. And they asked questions like, does it have moral ends? Or are you just trying to get something you didn't have before? So they said if somebody had invaded you and taken your territory, you could go to war with them to get it back, but you shouldn't invade someone else's territory in war just to get more of your own stuff. Or they said you had to be sure to think about who was going to declare the war. It had to be a properly constituted authority. I can't go to war against France, right? But maybe the United States government could. And whatever the war is, whatever your response, it has to be proportional, commensurate to the initial offense. And then there's rules about what happens in war, how you treat one another, things like not executing prisoners or children. People spend a lot of time thinking about this and a lot of time arguing about it for all the good it did. And all this thinking, all these rules were about civil authorities, were about governments, right? What governments could and couldn't do. But there's another great tradition of thinking about war, great in the sense of huge, not necessarily great in the moral sense. This had to do not with civil authorities and achieving the ends of nation states and governments, but it had to do with trying to achieve God's ends. For all during this same time, people believed that it was okay to go to war on God's behalf, to further God's purposes. Those infidels in that far land there do not believe in our God. It is our job to go there and tell them about our God using our swords. Those people over there have taken a city that is central to our faith, and they don't believe what we believe, so we must go and take that city back. These people right next door to us, we're Christians, and they're Christians too, but they're just slightly a different kind of Christian than we are, and so we must go to war to see which one of us is correct. You know the word for this way of thinking about war. They call it crusade. There's a third way of thinking about war, at least one other. It grew wildly in the last 100 years or so, but there have been people that ascribe to this way of thinking for many years before that. These are the people who say that war is never the answer. that violence always begets violence, that no war ever ends. It just has a continuation further down the road, no matter what the treaty that ends it. They say that Christians must never participate in violence or war of any kind, and you know what these people are called. We are, some of these people, pacifists, right? And each of these three great traditions of thinking about war, they all have biblical precedent. Every one of them can find underpinnings in our Bible, the stories and traditions of our faith. Not so long ago, 30 years, 40, maybe a few more, people started to say, well, all that thinking about war is well and good. And everyone who thinks and talks about war, by the way, will at least give lip service to the notion that peace is preferable to war. So they all have peace in the mix there somewhere, no matter what it is they're saying about war. But a new group of people started asking this question, why do we think about war so much? And what makes for a good war? Why don't we spend some time thinking about peace? And what makes for a good peace? Because there's peace, and then there's peace, right? There's often not peace in my house. It's often noisy and loud and boisterous, and there is wall bouncing and wall climbing. There is yelling and shouting. And here's one way I could achieve peace. I could put my children in 4-point restraints in their beds. I could fill their mouths with a gag and cover their eyes with a blindfold and pull the covers up over their face, turn off the lights, and leave the room. And it would then be quiet in my house. It would be peaceful in a way. But you know this, there would be no peace in any heart in that house. So too with the great peaces that have obtained throughout history, the Pax Romana, you've heard of this. Well, was the Roman peace peaceful for Jesus? The Pax Britannica, was the British peace peaceful for the people of India? There's peace, and then there's peace. So people started to ask, what is it that makes for peace? And they studied, and they prayed, and they talked, and they learned. And a movement was born, and one of the flowers of that movement opened wide in the summer of 1985 in the city of Ames, Iowa, of all places, at the 15th General Synod of the United Church of Christ, when our whole United Church of Christ took a vote to become a just peace church. At the beginning of every service, I hope you hear me welcoming you to an open and affirming Just Peace New Sanctuary Congregation of the United Church of Christ. This is the Just Peace we're talking about. If you want to read a great long document, there are a bunch of copies of the resolution that made that happen in 1985 on the table in the back of the sanctuary. You can pick that up later. The name they chose for this movement was significant, of course. You can understand that language, just peace, in lots of different ways. You can understand it as just peace and nothing else. We will not settle for anything just for peace. It is, of course, a play on that language, just war. We spent so long thinking about what a just war looks like. Now let's think about what a just peace looks like. And the order of those words matter too. It's not peace with justice. In one sense, that means the same thing. But saying just peace insists that justice precedes peace. And you know this, I hope, not justice like the so-called Justice Center meets out down the road. This is justice not in terms of retribution or punishment, but justice at the front end, in terms of distribution. Who gets what? What is enough to live, and who ought to have access to it? Who should have a voice, and who doesn't? You can create peace by shackling people and silencing them and covering them up and disappearing them. You can create peace of a sort, but it's not a peace that will ever last. So this is a peace that we're trying to achieve that assumes that it must stand on justice. And it's not the peace like the Romans did. The Romans always had a lot of beautiful temples to the goddess Pax, to peace. But they were always set right in the middle of the great field of Mars, the god of war. You had to march through the marshalling grounds, literally, to get to peace in the Roman mind. This is a different thing. That happened in 1985. Just a few years later, in 1993, Plymouth Church, your Plymouth Church, after a period of study and discernment and prayer, declared itself a just peace congregation. The declaration that did that was voted on in congregational meeting by some of you and some others who have gone on to blessed memory. That's in your bulletin, pages 5 and 6. You can read up on that now or some other time. And you'll see there that we identified 2 priorities in those first days. First of all, figuring out how best to welcome LGBTQ people, although not all those letters were in there at the time. And second of all, racial justice, figuring out this race problem that we have in these United States and in these hearts of ours. Just a few years later, Plymouth took a vote and became an open and affirming congregation, which means that we explicitly welcomed then lesbian and gay people and their leadership and their gifts into the full life of the church. In 2013, we did another process and officially added what had functionally been true for a long time, a welcome to transgender and bisexual people. I hope that list will continue to expand. On the question of race, well, we're still working on that. The very next opportunity for you to do that will be coming up on October 1st when we start doing another period of study and reflection and prayer to try to dive deep into that sin that's burning a hole in all of our hearts. 2 years ago, the then General Synod of the United Church of Christ asked us all to, on this very Sunday, spend a little while thinking about just peace. So that's what we're doing now, in case you're wondering why today. It's because they asked us to, back on the 30th anniversary of that great new movement in our church. There are lots of ways to think about war. There are lots of ways to think about peace. There's war and then there's war. There's peace and then there's peace. You could achieve peace by burying some of God's children and restraining them in the mud, by covering their eyes with silt and filling their mouths with seawater and drawing the waters over their head. It would be peaceful after a fashion. Then you would leave God asking, how can you celebrate when some of my children have died?